I'm going to get started and just let everyone know that you are free to reach out to myself, Erika, Director of Community Engagement here at School and State, as well as Melanie, who is our Community Engagement Manager, with any questions, thoughts, ideas you have. We are happy to have a conversation. For those of you who don't know, we're an organization that was started in 2015. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. And our goal is to work collaboratively with policymakers, school district officials, community leaders, and community members to develop data-driven solutions, ensuring that all public schools receive equitable education funding. So that's a little bit about who we are. I do want to share in this presentation that we have this app, Ed Explorer, and it lets you access district and school level data, both for funding, demographics, and also for student performance. So you can compare districts, you can look at your own, and you can also look at schools. So tonight we're going to talk about three different pieces. How education is funded by the state through the education cost sharing formula. For most of you, this is a recap, but it's critical to the conversation about what the future holds for us in this current legislative session. And we'll talk about the legislative process and your role, what to expect during this legislative session. So we'll start with just a total overview of K-12 education funding. In Connecticut, we're spending about $13.7 billion a year on K-12. A small percentage of that, about 1.1 billion, comes from the federal government. The lion's share of that comes from local taxpayers. That's your green bar at the bottom, about 7.8 billion. And 4.8 billion, that orange, about 35% of all revenue is from state sources. So this can be broken down into multiple categories. K-12 funding flows into school in a variety of pathways. But tonight we're going to really focus our energy on that 64% wedge. That is education cost sharing and alliance district grants for local and regional public school districts. So let's talk about the education cost sharing formula. And this is the formula ECS, which is used to distribute state aid to municipalities for their local and regional public school districts. And this education cost sharing formula is intended to do two things. It is intended to calculate how much it would cost any single district to educate their kids, and then how much of that cost does the state need to pay. So we're going to look at this in two distinct chunks. And the first is we need to figure out mathematically for the state how much it costs to educate children in any given district. So Stamford, Newtown, New London, what does it cost? And it starts by providing a foundation amount. And this foundation amount is the cost to educate a child who has no additional or unique learning needs, a general education student. Currently, it is $11,525. It's important to note that this foundation amount is established by the legislature, and it will come back up as we talk about legislative session. The foundation amount has not been adjusted since 2013. So this is the number it was in 2013. It does not move with inflation, does not adjust. It is a static number. And if it were adjusted for inflation in 2025, that number would be almost $16,000. That's the foundation amount, but we all know that kids come to school with different learning needs. And so the state looks at those and calculating, again, how much does it cost to educate kids in any given district? And so students who are identified in the formula as low income are students who qualify for free or reduced price lunch. That weight is 30% in addition to the 11,525, so 30% more. If a district has more than 60% of their students qualifying for free or reduced price lunch, then the weight above that 60% number is an additional 15%, but only for the number above 60%. And then finally, we know that multilingual learners come to school with additional learning needs. These students are mastering both a grade level content and a second language. And so the state says that cost is about 25% more than the 11,525. Now, when we look at this, we look at the impact of money on funding for districts. And you can see, and it's important to note, these weights are not one or the other. So for instance, if a child qualifies for free and reduced price lunch and is also a multilingual learner, you're seeing the assumed cost and then funding for that student to be about $17,864. So the funding ranges, and the state is looking every year at who is in any of our school districts. When they calculate how much it's going to cost to educate the kids in any given district, the next thing they're going to look at is how much is a town able to contribute to that cost, and how much support does the state need to provide. And in essence, they look at two things. One is property wealth. You can think of this as how much can your town raise in funding for schools, right? It's your property tax access. And income wealth. How much wealth do people have to afford property taxes? So when we look at property wealth, it's 70% and income wealth is 30%. How much can a community raise in revenue through property taxes? And are their residents able to pay those raised property taxes? And that's at a ratio of 70-30. It's important to know that these numbers are changing every year. Unlike the foundation amount, which has been flat since 2013, what we're looking at here is that every year the state is looking at who is in every school district, what their associated needs are, but they're also looking at property wealth measured by equalized net grand list per capita, how much property wealth per person. And they're also looking at the income of town residents through median household income. And I think sometimes these factors being calculated every year, if a town goes through revaluation for property and property wealth increases, ultimately it changes the aid the state provides to the school district. And I think it's really important to note that there are a lot of factors that come into play as we look at that calculation annually. So that's how they're deciding. And if you would like to know what that looks like for your district, shoot me an email and I'm happy to send you details on your district, other districts, however we can provide that information. But when we talk about that, that's the primary mechanism for figuring out how much money flows into your city or town for education aid. So now we need to look a little bit more at the legislature, because so much of this, I've told you, sits with them. So all state grants are legislatively appropriated and directed for K-12. And it's so important. The civics of education are complex, and it's important for you to know how to navigate this up at the General Assembly and what's happening, so that your voice is represented appropriately in all of the spaces. Our General Assembly, as you all know, is a part-time General Assembly. And so they convene every year to consider changes to state laws and funding appropriations. And while in odd years, we have a longer session, this year is an even year, 2026. It's a short session. It runs from February to May. In total, this legislative session has 55 business days. It's a short session. In a long session, the legislature develops the entire budget, and the budget is always a 2-year budget. So in a short year, what they're looking at is what modifications need to happen. Are we on track for revenue? Are there things that we didn't consider that we do need to start spending on in a short year? So you've already seen the governor's proposal was released in February, and Melanie will have a link that she can drop in the chat for everyone, but I can also pull it up after this presentation for discussion to look at what that proposal looks like right now for K-12. You can also find the budget as is by the governor, and we have a link here. We're happy to send this presentation out to everybody who registered so that you can look at those documents, not just through our mechanism, but on your own if you would like. So the governor puts forward his budget with his recommended changes. But at the same time, individual legislators are also proposing legislation, and legislative committees can put forward changes to statutes as well as statutory grants and funding. So bills that are proposed for legislative action are first moved to the correct committee. So if you are a legislator and you want to affect something in K-12 education, that piece of legislation goes to the Education Committee. And so changes to our statutory education grants, like ECS, go first to the Education Committee. Recommended changes to the distribution of grants that are not currently formulaic, like already in the formula, would also be considered by the Appropriations Committee. So legislative committees will then conduct public hearings. In appropriations, they'll have a public hearing on the governor's budget, and that is already scheduled for February 17th for K-12. In the Education Committee, they will have public hearings for legislation that they are considering. They've currently identified legislation that they are moving into committee, but they have not yet scheduled public hearings or moved language into some of the what we call concept bills, the ideas. But it's important to weigh in on public hearings. And public hearings since COVID have been incredibly accessible. They are hybrid. They are available for you to go up to Hartford and be in person or to be on Zoom. But you can also always submit testimony in writing. Oral testimony, if you opt to go in person, if you opt to participate in hybrid form, it cannot be longer than 3 minutes. So practice. Absolutely practice that, because 3 minutes flies by and you'll think that what you're saying, you have more time. But legislators do consider the testimony when considering whether to move a bill forward. And I want to acknowledge that because there are examples in our work, and most of our work has been successful because of participation of community members weighing in on public hearings. And the best example is that our education cost sharing formula, the most recent iteration, was supposed to be a 10-year phase in. And community lobbying to move that to a shorter phase in, allowed it to become 8 years and allowed us to have full funding of education cost sharing for the first time since it was implemented in infancy in 1988. So your voice does matter. And if you cannot be there or can't be on Zoom, submit in writing. It's incredibly important. We'll have this public hearing and it feels like there's a crash of momentum, right? We've all weighed in on changes that we want to see. We've said it's valuable. And while there's not a large open process after that of what happens next, there is still opportunity to continue making sure that it is a priority. You can email your legislative delegation with your testimony and say, hey, if you didn't see this, I'd like you to be aware. You can ask to meet with your legislative delegation to say, I want to let you know why this is important to me. And the more the merrier. One person doing that is great, but when you bring together stakeholders, and whether that is parents, educators, city council members, board of ed members, superintendents, whoever you can bring together, it is an incredibly powerful statement when people unify and come around something, and also take time out of very busy schedules to elevate an issue. So that's the mechanics of legislative session and what we're looking at, right? Less than 55 days now. We've eaten up a few of those. So let's talk about what we're seeing, what we're anticipating, and what we see the conversation being. As I drafted this, and I think this still holds true, when I drafted this, we were 5 days into legislative session. I think that is today. So we will see a ton more proposed bills over the next 2 weeks or so. What we're seeing right now is a particular interest in raising that foundation amount. And what we're seeing are proposals that range in number from raising it from 11,525, as a reminder of where we are now, to a range of somewhere between 13,500 and a little over 18,000 per student. And some of those increases are incredibly costly to the state. If you were to raise the foundation amount to over 18,000, the annual over where we are with budget now is about $1.2 billion more. So the cost ranges, and the cost does matter with the legislature, right? So that 13,500 comes in at about 350 million. So we are seeing a lot of interest in changing that foundation amount. We are also starting to see bills, and this includes the governor's budget, proposing making school breakfast free. And changing school lunch and making it free for students who are currently eligible for reduced price lunch. But we know there are a lot more proposals out there for food security for not just students, but for families and the elderly as well. So nutrition is a consistent theme. And we are seeing bills that and bills that are currently being drafted that recommend increasing the foundation amount with inflation. And I want to point out the importance of some of this. The education cost sharing grant is fully funded. So for the past 8 years, we've been phasing in a significant number of districts that have been underfunded according to the formula. And those phase-ins have happened over a period of 8 years, not all at once. And again, when we look at cost concerns, the reason for the phase-in is the cost was always the cost concern. This year, districts are fully funded, which means any changes in costs that happen now for local and regional school districts come at the expense of local taxpayers. So we know things, salaries are going to increase by contract. We know transportation has increased in health insurance and simple utilities. But there is no current mechanism for additional continued increases that reflect the growing on the ground needs for school districts. So both inflationary ties and an adjustment to the foundation amount are incredibly important. There is, and I will talk about this after the presentation, we also can talk about the concept of student-centered funding, which is equitable funding and continuing to maintain funding and support for choice schools that align with the education cost sharing formula and weights. And I haven't built that into this. We will talk about it after this presentation. So I just want to flag that for all of you. And for those of you who want to reach out after, happy to have that conversation as well. So we've seen a lot of concept bills in the Education Committee, and they have been moved into proposed bills. That's going to mean we're going to see better language and more clarity on what some of these ideas really mean. And then what we are anticipating is public hearings. I will say this entire timeline of from bills being concepts, ideas that are being floated in committee, to proposed bills through the public hearing process, all public hearings need to be completed by the end of March. So this is going to happen really rapidly for everybody. And then from March, they really only have the month of April to hammer everything out. So things are going to come fast and furious, and it's going to be important to stay engaged. And I say that because we have seen, and even in last year's legislative session, where bills have passed unanimously out of the Education Committee, and even have passed out of a chamber, but stopped when the other chamber has failed to take action. So exerting pressure throughout the process matters. And I think sometimes because you can't see that part, it feels like you're not moving things. The other thing I want to flag is that we'll have a lot of legislators who say, well, I'm not in the room on those conversations now. And I think it's important to share that they have access to the people who are and need to continue to reflect the needs of their community and district. It understandably, they aren't always in the room, but that doesn't mean that they don't have influence. So please remember that.